Imagine this. You're inside your own home, the one place where you should feel completely safe. An intruder breaks in. You manage to grab your phone. Your fingers dial 911. The call connects. You can hear it ringing, connecting to the emergency dispatcher. But then, instead of help arriving, instead of sirens and flashing lights, there's only silence. No one comes. For 48 agonizing minutes, you lie there, fighting for your life, wondering why no one is coming to save you. This isn't a nightmare. This isn't fiction. This is exactly what happened to 21-year-old Brittany Zimmermann on April 2nd, 2008, in Madison, Wisconsin. And what makes this case even more disturbing is that her 911 call was received, it was heard, but help was never sent. By the time anyone arrived, it was too late. This is the story of a young woman with unlimited potential, a systemic failure that cost her everything, and a 12-year fight for justice that would test the limits of one family's determination. Before we begin, if you value the work we do here at the Untold Cold Case, bringing you these important stories, please hit that like button, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps us continue this important work. To understand the tragedy of what happened to Brittany Zimmermann, you first need to understand who she was. This wasn't just another random victim. This was a young woman who had her entire life mapped out ahead of her, who knew exactly where she was going and how she was going to get there. Brittany grew up in Marshfield, Wisconsin, a small town where everyone knew everyone. From an early age, she stood out. While other kids her age were still figuring out what they wanted to be when they grew up, Brittany already had a plan. She wanted to help people. She wanted to make a difference. And she wasn't just dreaming about it, she was actively working toward it every single day. Her ultimate goal was ambitious, perhaps even audacious for a small-town girl. She wanted to become a doctor. Not just any doctor, but one who specialized in diseases and infectious disease research. Her dream job was to work at the Center for Disease Control in Hawaii. It was specific, it was challenging, and it was exactly the kind of goal that perfectly captured who Brittany was as a person. But Brittany understood something that many young people don't fully grasp until much later. She understood that dreams don't just happen. They require planning, dedication, and relentless hard work. So starting in her freshman year of high school, Brittany began working closely with her guidance counselor to map out every step of her journey. She knew that getting into prestigious universities and competitive medical school programs would require more than just excellent grades. It would require a track record of excellence in multiple areas. So Brittany threw herself into everything. She joined the Spanish club, expanding her language skills and cultural awareness. She participated in the school band, demonstrating commitment and teamwork. She became a member of the National Honor Society, solidifying her academic credentials. But perhaps most tellingly, most indicative of her character, she consistently volunteered at the American Cancer Society Hope Lodge. Even as a teenager, Brittany was already living out her mission of helping others, of making a tangible difference in people's lives during their most difficult moments. When Brittany graduated from high school in 2005, she had built an impressive resume. She had demonstrated not just intelligence, but character, not just ambition, but compassion. And all of that hard work paid off when she was accepted to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, located a little over 2 hours from her hometown. At UW-Madison, Brittany chose to major in immunology and microbiology. These weren't easy majors. These were rigorous, demanding fields of study that required intense focus and dedication. Many students would have been intimidated. Many would have questioned whether they could handle the workload. But not Brittany. She thrived. During her first 2 semesters, she made the dean's list, proving beyond any doubt that she had both the intelligence and the work ethic to achieve her ambitious goals. College can be a disorienting time for many young people. You're away from home, possibly for the first time. You're navigating new social situations, academic pressures, and the general chaos that comes with young adulthood. But throughout all of these changes, Brittany had one constant in her life. Her boyfriend, Gersper. Brittany and Jordan had known each other nearly their entire lives. They'd grown up in the same small town, attended the same schools, moved through the same circles. When they officially began dating in high school, it quickly became clear that this wasn't just a typical teenage romance. This was something deeper, something more substantial. Their relationship was serious enough that when Brittany went off to UW-Madison, Jordan eventually transferred to the same university, just to be closer to her. Together, they found an apartment in downtown Madison. It was perfect for their needs, close enough to campus for an easy commute, but far enough away to provide the independence and privacy that off-campus living offered. For two college students trying to balance demanding academic schedules with their relationship, it was an ideal setup. But Brittany, ever responsible and aware, took safety seriously. She wasn't naive about the realities of living in a larger city. She understood that downtown Madison, while not particularly dangerous, did have its share of crime. There was a noticeable homeless population in the area. Property crimes occurred. Break-ins happened. So Brittany was vigilant. She always kept the doors locked. Windows were secured. She maintained an acute awareness of her surroundings. Both she and Jordan understood the importance of these precautions. They locked their cars, secured their front door, and never left windows open or unlocked. These weren't paranoid measures. This was simply common sense for anyone living in a city. But here's the important thing to understand about Brittany. While she took safety seriously, she refused to let fear control her life. She refused to let caution prevent her from living fully and pursuing her dreams with everything she had. And make no mistake, Brittany was living life to the absolute fullest. Her schedule would have overwhelmed most people. She was carrying a full course load in one of the most challenging majors the university offered. She was working a job on campus. She was maintaining her relationship with Jordan. And on top of all of that, she was planning a wedding. That's right. Jordan had proposed, and they had begun making plans for their dream ceremony in Hawaii. The same Hawaii where Brittany hoped to one day work at the CDC. It was all coming together perfectly. The job Brittany worked was in the registrar's office on campus. Now, if you've never worked in a registrar's office, let me tell you, it's not glamorous work. It's not exciting. It involves documenting student records, scanning them, organizing them, filing them away. It's tedious, repetitive, and frankly, most students would find it mind-numbingly boring. But not Brittany. Brittany approached this job with the same positive attitude and dedication she brought to everything else in her life. Her supervisors and co-workers consistently praised her work ethic. She always wore a smile. She never complained. And here's what really stood out. She didn't just do the job, she improved the job. She created an entirely new organizational system for the documents, an initiative that was greatly appreciated by everyone in the office. This level of proactivity, this level of dedication, is rare, especially in a part-time campus job that most students view as just a paycheck. But that was Brittany. Everyone who knew her described her the same way. Positive, optimistic, glass half full. When she learned just how long and grueling the pre-med path would be, how many years of difficult studying and residencies and examinations stood between her and her dream, she didn't flinch. She didn't complain. She simply accepted it and got to work. She wanted to marry Jordan. She wanted to have children. She knew her rigorous education might complicate those plans in the short term. But she never dwelled on obstacles. She never harbored negativity. She trusted in herself and believed that if she wanted something badly enough, she would make it happen. By the spring of 2008, Brittany's life was busier than ever. Her classes had become increasingly demanding and time-consuming. In fact, they'd become so challenging that Brittany, despite her well-known drive and incredible work ethic, made the difficult decision to take a semester off from her campus job. Think about that for a moment. This was a young woman who had juggled multiple extracurricular activities throughout high school, who had made the dean's list while working and planning a wedding, who never complained about workload or stress. If even she felt the need to lighten her load, you can imagine just how difficult these classes had become. Her absence from the registrar's office was a significant loss for everyone there. But Brittany's academic progress was far more important. This was her future. This was her path to becoming a doctor, to working at the CDC, to achieving everything she'd been working towards since freshman year of high school. That spring semester, Brittany attended all her classes diligently. She worked hard to stay on top of everything. It had been a challenging few months, probably one of the most academically demanding periods of her life so far. But as April approached, she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The semester was almost over. Final papers and exams were on the horizon. Like students everywhere, Brittany and Jordan were scrambling to complete last-minute studying and assignments, preparing for that final push before summer break. April 2nd, 2008, began like any other day. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing that would have suggested that this day would be any different from the hundreds of other days that had come before it. Brittany woke up, got ready, and headed to campus for her morning class. The class ended at 11:30 a.m. Afterward, she and a friend lingered to speak with their professor. They had questions about their final papers, concerns about the upcoming exams. The professor answered their questions, provided guidance, and then Brittany and her friend left the building. Outside, Jordan happened to spot Brittany from a nearby balcony where he'd been. He called her cell phone, and they chatted briefly. Just a normal conversation between two people who loved each other, probably discussing their plans for the rest of the day, maybe talking about what they'd do for dinner, or when they'd see each other next. After the call ended, Brittany made a decision. She decided to head back to the apartment to study. She had work to do, and home seemed like the best place to focus and get it done. On her way home, at 11:57 a.m., Brittany tried calling her mother. The call went unanswered. Her mother was probably busy, probably doing something that seemed important at the time. She'd call Brittany back later. There would be time to talk. Except, as it turned out, there wouldn't be. Brittany arrived home and immediately logged onto her computer. Based on her activity logs, she was online from approximately noon until 12:18 p.m. Just 18 minutes. 18 minutes of normal college student activity, probably checking emails, maybe looking at class notes, perhaps doing research for one of her papers. 18 minutes of ordinary life. And then something happened. Something interrupted her. Something forced her to stop what she was doing, to abandon her computer, to shift her focus to something else entirely. She had no idea just how bad things were about to become. None of us ever do. At 12:19 p.m., just 1 minute after Brittany's computer activity ceased, a call was placed to 911 from her cell phone. But this wasn't a normal 911 call. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher didn't hear a clear voice calmly explaining an emergency. Instead, the dispatcher heard only muffled sounds, indistinct screaming, and then abruptly, the call disconnected. The dispatcher, a veteran operator with years of experience, made a decision in that moment. A decision that would haunt this case for years to come. That would become one of the most controversial aspects of this entire tragedy. The dispatcher concluded that this was an accidental dial, a pocket dial, a mistake. No callback was made to Brittany's number. No officer was dispatched to investigate. No help was sent. The call was simply dismissed and forgotten. At that exact moment, Brittany Zimmermann was fighting for her life inside her apartment, just blocks away from the police station. And nobody was coming to help her. 48 minutes passed. 48 minutes of unimaginable terror. 48 minutes of pain, of fear, of desperate hope that at any moment officers would burst through the door and save her. But they never came. Just after 1 p.m., another call came into 911. This time, a voice was clearly heard. This time, the caller was audible, understandable, and absolutely frantic. It was Jordan, and what he was calling to report would shatter his world forever. Jordan had also been on campus that morning, attending his own classes. His last class concluded at 12:55 p.m. He decided to head home quickly to take care of a few things at the apartment. Since they lived close to campus, the trip home was short. He arrived just after 1 p.m., probably thinking about what he needed to get done, maybe thinking about his upcoming exams, perhaps wondering if Brittany was home and how her studying was going. As Jordan climbed the stairs and approached their apartment door, something immediately felt wrong. You know that feeling, that instinctive sense that something isn't right? That's what Jordan experienced in that moment. The lock on their door was visibly broken. It hadn't just been picked or manipulated. It had been forced open with considerable violence. Someone had kicked it in or shouldered it open with significant force. Unsure of what he was about to discover, Jordan stepped inside. He moved toward the back of the apartment, toward the bedroom. He never made it that far. Before he could reach the bedroom, he found her. Brittany lay unresponsive on the floor. In an instant, Jordan's world collapsed. Everything he'd been thinking about, worrying about, planning for, all of it became completely meaningless. Nothing mattered except the scene in front of him. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His hands were probably shaking. His voice was probably breaking. There was blood everywhere. A massive amount of blood. More blood than Jordan had probably ever seen in his life. In his shock and panic, he told the dispatcher he thought Brittany had been shot. That was the only explanation his mind could produce for the amount of blood he was seeing. While still on the phone, the dispatcher walked him through checking Brittany's condition. They instructed him to check inside her mouth for any obstructions to her breathing. That's when Jordan realized something that made the situation even worse, if that was possible. Brittany was cold to the touch. When he tried to grasp her hand, perhaps to offer some comfort, perhaps to feel some connection to the person he loved, her fingers were stiff. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in. Police arrived at the scene just minutes later at 1:08 p.m. When they entered the apartment, they found Jordan visibly shaken, clearly in a profound state of shock. He was weeping uncontrollably, repeating through his tears the same phrase over and over again. She was the nicest person ever. Who would do this? She was the nicest person ever. Who would do this? Though Jordan knew the moment he saw her that she was gone, Brittany was officially pronounced dead at the scene at 1:34 p.m., approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes after she'd made that 911 call. Despite Jordan's initial belief that Brittany had been shot, the first responders on scene quickly determined that wasn't the case. There were no gunshot wounds, no shell casings, no evidence of a firearm being used. An official autopsy would be required to confirm the exact manner of death, but it was disturbingly clear that a violent struggle had taken place inside that apartment. Brittany had been stabbed at least once, possibly multiple times. And there were other signs of trauma as well. Jordan was interviewed almost immediately. In most cases involving the death of a young woman, the boyfriend or spouse is the first person investigators look at. Statistics show that when a woman is murdered, she's most likely to be killed by someone she knows, often an intimate partner. So police needed to rule Jordan in or out as quickly as possible. Fortunately, it became clear very quickly that Jordan had nothing whatsoever to do with this attack. His alibi was solid. He'd been in class at the time of Brittany's death, with dozens of witnesses who could confirm his presence. His grief was genuine, his shock was real, and there was simply no evidence connecting him to the crime. When investigators asked Jordan if any valuables had been taken from the apartment, suggesting a possible robbery gone wrong, he admitted he hadn't had time to check. He'd been so focused on Brittany, so overwhelmed by what he'd discovered, that he hadn't even thought to look around and see what might be missing. But as investigators began processing the scene, they noticed something interesting. Both Brittany and Jordan's computers remained in plain sight. These were likely the most expensive items in the apartment. If this had been a simple robbery, if the motive had been theft, those computers would have been the first things taken. But they were still there, untouched. Despite the lack of obviously stolen property, investigators still had plenty of evidence to work with. In fact, they had an abundance of physical evidence. They collected Brittany's bloody clothing. They found bloody women's slippers near the body. They recovered a paper towel with an unknown red substance on it. They collected a sheet of computer paper that appeared to have drops of blood on it. They took 18 different blood samples from various locations throughout the apartment. They even removed 2 sink traps along with their contents, hoping that perhaps the perpetrator had attempted to clean up before fleeing and might have left trace evidence behind. In total, investigators collected 23 DNA swabs from the scene. They lifted 10 fingerprints. They documented and photographed 9 partial footprints from inside the apartment. This was an impressive amount of physical evidence. In many cases, investigators struggled to find any usable forensic evidence at all. Here, they had an abundance of material to work with. DNA, fingerprints, footprints, blood spatter patterns. Everything they needed to identify and prosecute whoever had done this. The abundance of evidence suggested that this case would be solved relatively quickly. How could it not be? They had DNA. They had fingerprints. They had a fresh crime scene with lots of physical evidence. Surely, it was only a matter of time before they ran this evidence through databases, found a match, and arrested the perpetrator. But as it would tragically turn out, nothing could have been further from the truth. This case wouldn't be solved quickly. It wouldn't be solved in months. It would take 12 long, agonizing years before Brittany's family finally got the answers they desperately needed. Despite the lack of obviously stolen valuables from Brittany and Jordan's apartment, investigators initially suspected that some form of robbery or burglary had been the motive. This theory wasn't pulled out of thin air. There had been a significant wave of break-ins throughout Madison in the months and weeks leading up to Brittany's death. Many of these break-ins were attributed to members of the homeless community in the area. Consequently, investigators began looking into homeless men who had recent encounters with law enforcement, who had histories of breaking into homes or apartments, who fit the general profile of someone who might have committed this crime. During the initial weeks of the investigation, detectives remained notably tight-lipped about any updates or progress. Even Brittany's family was kept largely in the dark about what investigators were finding, what leads they were pursuing, what suspects they were looking at. This silence, while perhaps necessary for the integrity of investigation, was incredibly frustrating for everyone who loved Brittany and desperately wanted answers. Then the autopsy results came back, and they painted a horrifying picture of Brittany's final moments. The medical examiner determined that Brittany had died from what was termed complex homicidal violence. This wasn't a simple assault. This wasn't a single stab wound or a brief altercation. Brittany had been stabbed multiple times. She had been strangled. She had also been beaten. The level of violence was extreme, personal, vicious. Nearly half of the stab wounds had been directed at her heart, suggesting that whoever did this wanted to ensure she didn't survive. The questions now facing investigators were simple but devastating. Who would commit such a brutal act? Why? And where was this person now, walking free somewhere in Madison, potentially preparing to strike again? Word quickly spread throughout the Madison community that multiple homeless men had been interviewed in connection with Brittany's death. And with that information came rumors, whispers, theories. Some people began to question whether Brittany had been too kind, too trusting, too willing to help homeless individuals who approached her. Had her compassionate nature, her desire to help people, somehow contributed to her death? This speculation tapped into a larger controversy that was gripping Madison at the time. The city was perceived by many as being overly liberal in its approach to the homeless community. Policies had been implemented to assist homeless individuals. The Capitol basement maintained an open-door policy every single day, granting people access to temporary shelter, however brief. Every Sunday, the city hosted free community meals with no questions asked, no requirements, no restrictions. Residents in Madison were deeply divided on these issues. Some argued there weren't enough regulations, that the city was too permissive, that dangerous individuals were being allowed to roam freely without adequate oversight. Others believed existing policies had gone too far in the opposite direction, that the city was criminalizing homelessness and failing to provide adequate support and services. Some residents contended that the neighborhood where Brittany and Jordan lived was well known for homeless individuals approaching doors during the day, asking for money, or in some cases simply walking into homes if doors were left unlocked. Law enforcement made it very clear to the media and the public that they were looking at everyone. Repeat offenders within the homeless community were under scrutiny, but so were individuals with no prior criminal record. Authorities were convinced that Brittany's death had resulted from someone coming to her door to solicit money, someone who had then forced their way inside when they didn't get what they wanted. But there was another troubling detail that investigators couldn't ignore. Just a couple of months before Brittany's death, another eerily similar incident had occurred in Madison. On January 28, 2008, a 31-year-old man named Joel Marino had been at home speaking with his grandmother on the phone, wishing her a happy birthday, when the call was abruptly cut short. Someone had entered through his unlocked door and stabbed him to death. Joel sustained 2 stab wounds to the stomach. He attempted to reach a nearby hospital, which was mere yards away from his home, but he collapsed in an alley before he could get there. He died alone, just like Brittany would months later. Police in Joel's case had investigated over 175 tips. They'd combed through more than 3,000 mugshots of potential perpetrators. They'd identified 200 suspects. A $30,000 reward was offered for any information leading to an arrest and conviction. Yet despite all of these efforts, Joel's case remained open and unsolved, even by the time Brittany was murdered. Think about that for a moment. 2 separate incidents within just months of each other. Both victims were inside their homes, the places where they should have felt safest. Both victims were attacked when someone unexpectedly entered their residence. Both victims were stabbed to death. Both victims died before help could arrive. Was Madison facing a possible serial offender? Was there someone out there specifically targeting people in their homes? The fact that investigators shared very little information about either case only fueled public fear and speculation. People throughout Madison began changing their behaviors. They started locking their doors religiously, even during the day. Some began carrying weapons for self-defense. Many reported feeling unsafe even inside their own homes, wondering if they might be next, if their door might be the next one that was forced open. Adding to the community's mounting anxiety, there was yet another unsolved case hanging over Madison. The previous summer, in 2007, a college student named Kelly Nolan had vanished after a night of socializing at local bars. Her body was discovered 16 days later in a wooded area outside the city. Investigators believed she had been abducted, taken to that location, and killed there. By the time of Joel and Brittany's deaths, Kelly's case also remained completely unsolved. To this very day, her family continues searching for answers, continues fighting for justice, continues hoping that someone, somewhere, knows something that could finally bring them closure. 3 unsolved murder cases in under a year. 3 young people dead. 3 families shattered. Zero arrests. As you can imagine, residents throughout Madison began seriously questioning the capabilities of local law enforcement. Were police doing enough? Were they competent enough to solve these cases? Were resources being properly allocated? These questions became even more pointed, even more accusatory when the public learned about the 911 call Brittany had made before or during her attack. The 911 call. This detail would become one of the most controversial, most infuriating, most debated aspects of Brittany's entire case. Remember, it was known that Brittany had been on her computer from noon until 12:18 p.m. Her activity logs confirmed this. Just 1 minute later, at 12:19 p.m., she placed that call to 911 from her cell phone. The 911 dispatcher who received Brittany's call was a veteran operator, someone with years of experience handling emergency calls. Initially, this dispatcher informed investigators that nothing had been heard on the other end of the line. According to the dispatcher's account, they had asked repeated questions, standard questions like, "What is your emergency?" and "Can you hear me?" but received no response. When the line went dead, the dispatcher concluded it was an accidental dial and simply moved on to the next call. But during the first 2 weeks of the investigation, the dispatcher's story changed. Now the dispatcher claimed that a callback had been made to Brittany's number. According to this new version of events, 2 men had answered the phone, claimed they had called by accident, said they didn't need assistance, and that was the end of it. Case closed. No emergency. No need to dispatch officers. This claim, as it would later emerge, was a complete and total fabrication. The dispatcher had indeed made a callback after Brittany's call disconnected. But that callback hadn't been to Brittany's number. It had been to a completely different phone number. The wrong number. A mistake. No callback was ever actually made to Brittany's cell phone. And because no callback was made because the dispatcher had concluded this was just an accidental dial, no officers were ever dispatched to investigate. No one was sent to check on the situation. No help was on its way. The police station was literally just blocks away from Brittany and Jordan's apartment. Officers could have been there in minutes. But they never came. It wasn't until 48 minutes later, when Jordan made his desperate, panicked call after discovering Brittany's body, that police actually showed up at the apartment. When this information became public, when people learned that Brittany had successfully called 911, that her call had been received, but that no help had been sent, the outrage was immediate and intense. The entire community, the media, and most especially Brittany's family and friends were absolutely furious. They felt, rightfully, that Brittany had done everything right. She had followed every procedure taught from childhood about what to do in an emergency situation. Call 911. Get help. Trust that the system will work. And yet she had been failed in every conceivable way. She had made the call. The system had received it. But nobody came to help her until it was far too late. The dispatcher had clearly violated multiple policies and procedures. First, by failing to call Brittany's number back to verify whether there was an actual emergency. Second, by not sending an officer to investigate, even if the callback had been successful. When dealing with disconnected 911 calls where nothing clear is heard, the standard protocol is to treat it as a potential emergency until proven otherwise. That didn't happen here. The dispatcher attempted to defend their actions by arguing that police only conducted follow-ups for calls originating from landlines, not from cell phones. This distinction struck many people as not just nonsensical, but dangerously irresponsible. This was 2008. Cell phones had become ubiquitous. The vast majority of people, especially young people like Brittany, use cell phones as their primary or only phone. To suggest that 911 would respond to calls from landlines but not cell phones seemed not just outdated, but potentially deadly. The most distressing thought continued to haunt everyone involved in this case. If police had been dispatched during that phone call, if officers had arrived at the apartment at 12:20 or 12:25 or even 12:30, Brittany's attacker might still have been in the apartment. They might have been able to apprehend him right there at the scene. And most importantly, most devastatingly, Brittany herself might still have been alive. She might have had injuries that require medical attention, but she might have survived. Instead, she lay on the floor of her apartment for 48 agonizing minutes, slowly dying, no doubt hoping and praying that at any moment officers would burst through the door to save her. She had called for help. They had received her call. But nobody came. What proved most controversial in this entire ordeal was the apparent attempt by authorities to conceal or minimize the truth about what had happened with that call. For months, officials refused to release the actual recording of Brittany's 911 call. They asserted that doing so would hinder their ongoing investigation, that it would compromise their ability to solve the case, that it was necessary to keep this information confidential. They expected the public, expected Brittany's family, to simply trust them, to believe their version of events, to accept that the operator had heard nothing on the call and had acted appropriately in good faith. Public outrage, to put it mildly, was immense. And that outrage wasn't limited to Brittany's case. Joel Marino's parents spoke openly and forcefully about what they perceive as a complete lack of care and competence in handling both their son's case and Brittany's. Joel's father told the media in a scathing statement, "The county and city are more interested in fighting with each other and protecting egos than solving crimes." Joel's mother, in her desperation to get anyone, to take these cases seriously, emailed the state attorney general directly, begging him to take over the investigations from local authorities who seemed unable or unwilling to solve them. Eventually, four media outlets filed a formal lawsuit against Dane County for its refusal to release any information about Brittany's 911 call, the call made by Jordan when he discovered her body, and other related documents. This lawsuit represented a direct challenge to the wall of secrecy authorities had erected around these cases. The lawsuit, however, saw no significant movement for an entire year. It wasn't until 2009 that there was finally some progress. At that point, all documents except the actual audio recording of Brittany's 911 call were released to the media and the public. However, investigators did provide a transcript of the call, and that transcript was absolutely damning. The transcript unequivocally revealed clear signs of struggle. It documented sounds that should have undeniably, unquestionably prompted the operator to dispatch immediate assistance. There was screaming. There were sounds of a physical altercation. There were indications that someone was in distress and desperately needed help. This wasn't an accidental pocket dial. This wasn't someone's phone going off in their purse. This was a genuine emergency call from someone in mortal danger. The revelations from this lawsuit brought these facts into the public domain, where they sparked even more outrage and even more questions about how this catastrophic failure could have occurred. Then, a few months after Brittany's death, what seemed like a hopeful break in the cases finally emerged. Joel Marino's killer was apprehended and arrested. His name was Adam Peterson, a 20-year-old University of Wisconsin-Madison dropout. Peterson had been flagged as a possible suspect when Madison police conducted a review of individuals with potential mental health issues who had recently contacted police for various reasons. Adam had first contacted authorities on January 20th, 2008, about a week before Joel's death, to report a stolen laptop. He contacted them again shortly after Joel's death, once more about the same stolen laptop. The third contact came when Adam's roommate called police requesting a wellness check on him, concerned about his mental state and behavior. Eventually, investigators obtained a warrant for Adam's DNA. When the results came back, they had their answer. Adam's DNA matched DNA found on the knife used in Joel's murder. He was arrested and charged. Finally, after months of fear and uncertainty, Joel's family had answers. They knew who had taken their son from them, and why. But the question that haunted Brittany's family remained unanswered. Who had killed Brittany? Detectives announced publicly that Adam Peterson had not yet been ruled out as a suspect in Brittany's case. However, they also cautioned the media and the public that no direct connection between the two cases had been found. There was no evidence placing Adam at Brittany's apartment. There was no DNA match. There was no witness testimony. There was nothing concrete linking him to her death. Nevertheless, Brittany's family held on to hope. They hoped desperately that this development might somehow lead them one step closer to identifying their daughter's killer. Perhaps Adam knew something. Perhaps he'd seen something. Perhaps there was a connection that just hadn't been discovered yet. As the investigation continued, investigators spent countless hours conducting interviews throughout Madison, attempting to determine if any witnesses had seen anyone near Brittany's apartment on April 2nd, 2008, or in the days leading up to her death. This task proved to be far more challenging than it might initially appear. The area around Brittany and Jordan's apartment, as mentioned earlier, experienced significant foot traffic. There were numerous homeless individuals in the area. Many transients moving door to door, either asking for money or simply headed to their next destination. There was a constant ebb and flow of people, a constantly changing cast of characters. Trying to identify specific individuals who had been in that specific area on that specific day was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Nevertheless, authorities gradually began to narrow their focus to specific individuals who seemed more suspicious than others, who had troubling histories, who couldn't account for their whereabouts, or who had behaved strangely around the time of Brittany's death. The first man who drew significant attention was Thomas Cosgrove, a 51-year-old homeless man living in the Madison area. Thomas had recently been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon when he and another homeless man were discovered sleeping inside a campus building where they clearly weren't supposed to be. Investigators harbored such strong suspicions about Thomas's potential involvement in Brittany's death that they ultimately filed for separate search warrants in connection with him. Two of these warrants were aimed at obtaining surveillance footage from FedEx store near where Thomas frequently stayed, hoping that the footage might show his movements and activities on the day of Brittany's death. The other two warrants sought articles of clothing and other personal items belonging to Thomas that might contain forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene. When Thomas was questioned directly about Brittany's murder and the crime scene, his response was deeply unsettling. When asked if investigators would find his footprints inside Brittany's apartment, Thomas gave an answer that immediately raised red flags. He said he was unsure whether or not they would find his prints there. He claimed he didn't know. This answer struck detectives as profoundly alarming. Think about it. The expected response to such a question would be simple and straightforward. Either yes, you've been inside the apartment and your prints might be there, or no, you've never been inside and there's no way your prints would be there. It's a binary question with a binary answer. But Thomas's response was neither. He said he didn't know. He wasn't sure. What kind of answer is that? How could someone not know whether they'd been inside a specific apartment? Despite the search warrants, despite his suspicious answer, despite investigators' strong interest in him as a potential suspect, Thomas was eventually cleared. The evidence simply didn't support charging him. His DNA didn't match anything found at the scene. His fingerprints weren't found inside the apartment. Whatever suspicions investigators had, they couldn't back them up with hard evidence. Thomas was ruled out, and the search continued. The next man who drew investigators' attention was Jeffrey Ball, a 49-year-old homeless man with a troubling history. Jeffrey's case was particularly interesting because of the timing. He had actually been arrested on the very same day as Brittany's murder, April 2, 2008, for threatening to stab an employee at a location called Butler Plaza after he was found sleeping in the women's bathroom. Think about the significance of that. On the same day Brittany was stabbed to death, Jeffrey Ball was arrested for threatening to stab someone. But it gets even more concerning. When Jeffrey was arrested, he was found with a bloody knife in his possession. A bloody knife. On the same day, a young woman was stabbed to death just blocks away. This couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Investigators certainly didn't think so. They immediately filed search warrants to obtain Jeffrey's DNA, his clothing, and any other potential evidence that might link him to Brittany's apartment and her death. They analyzed the knife he'd been carrying, hoping it might be the murder weapon. They compared his DNA to the samples collected from Brittany's apartment. But once again, the evidence didn't support the suspicion. Jeffrey's DNA didn't match. The knife wasn't the murder weapon. Whatever else Jeffrey Ball might have been guilty of, he apparently wasn't guilty of murdering Brittany Zimmermann. He too was eventually cleared and ruled out as a suspect. A third individual entered the investigators' radar. His name was Shanny Mack, a 53-year-old homeless man known to frequent the area around Brittany's apartment. Shanty had been arrested a few weeks after Brittany's death, on May 5, 2008, following a physical altercation with another homeless man. What made Shanty interesting as a potential suspect wasn't just his presence in the area or his arrest. It was what witnesses claimed to have heard him say. Multiple people came forward and told detectives that they had overheard Shanty actually bragging, about being the one who had stabbed Brittany. According to these witnesses, Shanty had been talking about the murder, discussing details, and essentially taking credit for the crime. This was explosive information. If true, if Shanty had actually killed Brittany and was now running his mouth about it, this could be the break investigators desperately needed. They immediately obtained a search warrant for Shanty's DNA. But when confronted with these allegations, Shanty denied everything. He claimed he never said anything of the sort, that the witnesses were mistaken or lying. He had nothing to do with Brittany's death. And once again, the physical evidence couldn't substantiate the claims. Shanty's DNA didn't match anything from the crime scene. This lead, like the others before it, ultimately went nowhere. But there was another name that surfaced during the investigation. A name that would prove to be far more significant than anyone realized at the time. David Kahl. David was yet another homeless man within the Madison community, but unlike some of the others, David had a particularly extensive and troubling history with law enforcement. David had been a heavy substance user his entire adult life. His criminal record was long and varied. He'd faced multiple arrests for impaired driving. In fact, by the time his name came up in connection with Brittany's case, David had already accumulated 6 convictions for driving under the influence. He had a history of theft, of public intoxication, of various minor offenses that painted a picture of someone whose life had been consumed by addiction and poor choices. When witnesses reported seeing David in the area around Brittany's apartment on April 2, 2008, investigators brought him in for questioning. During the interview, David admitted freely that he had indeed been in that neighborhood on the day of Brittany's murder. He didn't deny it. He didn't claim to have been somewhere else. He acknowledged his presence. But David also provided an explanation for why he'd been there. He told investigators that he'd been engaged in what he described as a scam. He'd been going door to door throughout the area, approaching students and other younger people, telling them he needed $40 to fix a flat tire on his car. It was a lie, of course. David didn't need money for a tire. He needed money for drugs. But the flat tire story was sympathetic, believable, and often successful. People would give him money out of kindness, wanting to help someone they thought was having a bad day and just needed a little assistance to get back on the road. When asked specifically about Brittany Zimmermann, David adamantly denied knowing anything about her. He claimed he'd never heard her name before. He stated unequivocally that he knew nothing about her murder. And with only witness testimony placing him in the general vicinity, with no physical evidence linking him to the crime, his name was relegated to the back burner. Investigators noted it, filed it away, but moved on to pursue other leads that seemed more promising. Then, in December of 2008, something interesting happened. An individual who was incarcerated at a prison facility where David Kahl had recently served time on one of his many convictions provided police with a rather intriguing piece of information. According to this inmate, David had confided in him during their time together. And what David had allegedly said was deeply disturbing. According to this inmate's account, David had expressed worry, actual anxiety, that investigators working on Brittany's case would find his fingerprints around her throat and on her body. Think about the implications of that statement. Why would someone be worried about their fingerprints being found on a murder victim's body unless they had, in fact, touched that victim? Unless they had been there? Unless they had done something they shouldn't have done? This was undeniably alarming evidence. This wasn't just someone being placed in the general area. This was someone allegedly admitting to specific, intimate contact with the victim. Fingerprints around her throat would suggest strangulation, which matched the autopsy findings. This seemed like exactly the kind of break the case needed. But there was a problem. DNA technology in 2008, while certainly more advanced than it had been a decade earlier, still had significant limitations. And investigators, despite their diligent efforts to collect as much DNA and physical evidence as possible from Brittany's apartment, had not yet found a match to David Kahl's DNA in any database. They had done everything correctly in terms of evidence collection. They had gathered samples from multiple locations. They had preserved the integrity of the crime scene. They had followed proper protocols and procedures. They had an abundance of material to work with. But none of it matched any DNA profile in the national database. Not David Kahl's. Not anyone else's. The DNA they collected was either too degraded, too mixed with other DNA sources, or simply didn't belong to anyone whose profile was already in the system. It felt like a cruel, drawn-out waiting game. They had evidence. They had suspects. They had theories and witness statements and timelines. But they didn't have the one thing they desperately needed, that definitive link between a specific person and the crime scene that would allow them to make an arrest and move forward with prosecution. Unfortunately for Brittany's family, for her friends, for everyone who loved her and wanted justice, a very long and frustrating road still lay ahead. The agonizing lack of answers, the frustrating absence of progress, didn't end in 2008. As the months turned into years, as birthdays and anniversaries and holidays came and went without resolution, Brittany's family struggled with a grief that had no outlet, no closure, no sense of completion. In 2010, Jordan Gersper, Brittany's fiancé, the man who had discovered her body and would carry that trauma for the rest of his life, filed 2 separate lawsuits. These lawsuits were directed against the authorities Jordan believed had mishandled Brittany's 911 call. He contended that their negligence, their failure to follow proper procedures, their decision not to dispatch officers, had directly caused him severe and lasting emotional distress when he arrived home that day and discovered the woman he loved lying dead on the floor. Jordan's argument was straightforward and compelling. If the 911 system had functioned as it was supposed to, if the dispatcher had done their job correctly, if officers had been sent to investigate that disconnected call with screaming in the background, Brittany might still be alive. At the very least, Jordan wouldn't have been the one to find her. He wouldn't have had to make that desperate call to 911 himself. He wouldn't have had to see what he saw, experience what he experienced, carry those images in his mind forever. Unfortunately for Jordan, a court dismissed his case. The legal reasoning was technical but devastating. The court ruled that only family members related by blood or marriage would be legally permitted to file such a lawsuit. Despite the fact that Jordan and Brittany had been engaged, despite their plans to marry, despite their years together and their deep commitment to one another, Jordan didn't legally qualify as family. They hadn't been married yet. They were planning to be, but planning didn't count. Intent didn't count. Love didn't count. Only the legal status of marriage counted, and they hadn't reached that status before Brittany was killed. The dismissal must have felt like yet another injustice, yet another way the system had failed both him and Brittany. Also in 2010, Brittany's parents, Jean and Kevin Zimmermann, initiated 2 separate lawsuits of their own. The first lawsuit was directed against the owners and management of the apartment building where Brittany and Jordan had lived. Jean and Kevin argued that violations of building codes, failures to maintain proper security, and inadequate door locks had enabled the killer to break into the apartment through the front door. If the building had been up to code, if proper security measures had been in place, perhaps their daughter would still be alive. The second lawsuit filed by Brittany's parents was against Dane County itself. This lawsuit asserted that the mishandling of Brittany's 911 call had ultimately resulted in her death. The argument was similar to Jordan's, but came from parents who did have legal standing to sue. If the call had been handled properly, if help had been dispatched, if officers had arrived within minutes instead of the 48 minutes it actually took, Brittany might have survived. At a minimum, her killer might have been apprehended at the scene. Eventually, a settlement was reached with Dane County. The terms of the settlement were telling. The county agreed to allocate $55,000 toward the reward fund for finding Brittany's killer. They also agreed to contribute $2,500 to Jean and Kevin for their legal fees. As part of the settlement, both sides agreed not to discuss any details of the lawsuit or the settlement with the media. The matter was closed, sealed away behind a wall of confidential settlement agreements and non-disclosure clauses. The lawsuit against the apartment building's owners and management was also settled out of court, with both parties once again agreeing to complete silence about the details. What violations existed, what responsibility was acknowledged, what compensation was provided, all of that remains unknown to this day, locked away behind legal confidentiality agreements. And so the years continued to pass. 2009 became 2010. 2010 became 2011. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived and departed. And most painfully of all, the day arrived that should have been Brittany and Jordan's wedding day. The day they should have been standing together in Hawaii, exchanging vows, beginning their married life together, celebrating with family and friends. Instead, Brittany was gone, and Jordan was left to mark that day alone, remembering what should have been. Each milestone felt like a fresh wave of grief washing over everyone who had loved Brittany. Each anniversary of her death brought renewed pain, renewed frustration, renewed anger at the lack of progress. As time wore on, as the months stretched into years, Brittany's family began to fear something that might be even worse than not having answers. They began to fear that her case was slowly being forgotten. That investigators had moved on to newer cases, fresher leads, more solvable crimes. That Brittany was becoming just another cold case file in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust and fading from memory. Then on December 9, 2014, more than 6 years after Brittany's death, a new development finally emerged. A development that would reignite hope and restart the investigation in earnest. This significant breakthrough occurred when the state crime lab reported a DNA match. Not just any DNA match, but a match that connected directly to the evidence collected from Brittany's apartment on the day of her murder. The DNA that had been collected from Brittany's right shirt sleeve, DNA that had been sitting in evidence storage for over 6 years, now matched the DNA profile of someone investigators had already looked into. David Kahl, the homeless man who had admitted to being in the area that day. The man who had claimed he was running a scam, asking people for $40 for a flat tire. The man whose name had come up before, but had never been pursued aggressively because there hadn't been enough evidence to support an arrest. When this DNA match came back, David was already incarcerated, serving time for his 7th conviction for driving while impaired. His 7th conviction. This was someone who clearly hadn't learned from his previous 6 arrests, previous 6 convictions, previous 6 sentences. He was a repeat offender in every sense of the term. The DNA match was both welcome news and disheartening news for Brittany's family. It was welcome because finally, after more than 6 years of waiting, of wondering, of hoping for some kind of break in a case, they had something concrete. They had a name. They had scientific evidence linking that person to their daughter's clothing. They had a suspect who was already in custody, who couldn't flee, who couldn't disappear. But the news was also disheartening because investigators made it clear that the DNA match, while significant, wasn't strong enough on its own to support criminal charges. The science was there, yes, but it wasn't definitive enough. The DNA could have been transferred through innocent contact. David's defense could argue that he'd bumped into Brittany on the street, or shaken her hand, or had some other brief, innocent interaction that explained the presence of his DNA on her sleeve. Without additional evidence, without a stronger DNA match from a more significant location, without witness testimony or a confession or something else to corroborate the DNA evidence, prosecutors weren't confident they could secure a conviction. Investigators knew that if they intended to charge David Kahl with Brittany's murder, they would need more. They needed something that would eliminate reasonable doubt, something that would convince a jury beyond that high legal threshold required for a murder conviction. On the very same day the DNA result came back, December 9, 2014, detectives working the case learned something else that seemed almost providential in its timing. They discovered that David Kahl had been remarkably loose-lipped about his activities and his crimes while incarcerated. Specifically, he'd been talking to his cellmate, a man named Andrew Scouse, about things he probably should have kept to himself. Andrew Scouse, it turned out, was willing to talk to investigators. He was willing to provide information about what David had told him during their time together in the same cell. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. Andrew was only willing to cooperate if he received something in return. He wanted a deal. He wanted concessions. He wanted benefits for himself in exchange for whatever information he had about David Kahl and Brittany Zimmermann's murder. 2 days after learning that Andrew might be able to assist their investigation, detectives made the trip to West Virginia, where Andrew was being held in a federal correctional facility on an unlawful firearm possession charge. The detectives were hopeful, cautiously optimistic that this might be the break they needed. They had DNA evidence linking David to Brittany. If they also had testimony from a cellmate that David had confessed to the crime, that combination might be enough to finally bring charges. But when the detectives arrived and sat down with Andrew Scouse, their optimism quickly turned to frustration. Andrew was playing games. He stated that yes, David had confessed to killing Brittany Zimmermann. But when pressed for details, for specifics, for anything concrete that could be verified or corroborated, Andrew refused to provide it. He wouldn't give them the information they needed. He wouldn't tell them what David had actually said, what details David had provided, what admissions David had made. Was Andrew telling the truth? Had David really confessed to him? Or was Andrew fabricating this story, hoping to leverage some imaginary information into real benefits for himself? The detectives couldn't tell. They left West Virginia without the answers they'd hoped for, but with the knowledge that Andrew Scouse might possess information that could make or break their case. This marked the beginning of what would become a prolonged, frustrating struggle to extract what Andrew knew, or claimed to know, about David Kahl's involvement in Brittany's death. The detectives understood the stakes. Combined with the DNA evidence, Andrew's testimony could potentially be enough to arrest and charge David. But first, they had to get Andrew to actually provide that testimony, with details, with specifics, with something they could use. Andrew made his position clear. He would only disclose the specifics of what David had told him about Brittany's murder if both of his felony convictions were expunged from his record. Both of them. Completely erased, as if they'd never happened. His first conviction was from 2010, a controlled substance charge. Getting that expunged might be difficult, but it was at least theoretically possible through normal legal channels. But Andrew's second conviction was the federal firearm charge he was currently serving time for, the charge from 2014 that had landed him in federal prison. Getting a federal felony conviction expunged would require something far more significant than a typical legal motion. It would require a presidential pardon, an act of executive clemency from the President of the United States. Presidential pardons are extraordinarily rare. They are granted in exceptional circumstances, usually involving some compelling reason why justice would be better served by forgiveness than by punishment. They require extensive applications, background investigations, reviews by the Department of Justice, recommendations from prosecutors. The process is long, complex, and uncertain. And there was absolutely no guarantee that even if investigators wanted to pursue this avenue, even if they recommended a pardon for Andrew, that it would actually be granted. So there they were, agonizingly close to potentially securing justice for Brittany after more than 6 years of waiting. But simultaneously so far away, blocked by the demands of a man who valued his clean criminal record and his firearm collection more than he valued helping solve a young woman's murder. When Brittany's family learned of these developments, when they discovered that someone out there knew what had happened to their daughter, knew who had killed her, but wouldn't share that information without getting something for himself first, their devastation was profound. Their hopes, which had been raised by the DNA match, were now crushed by the realization that the key to justice was being held hostage by someone's self-interest. Jean Zimmermann, Brittany's mother, was so desperate, so willing to do anything to get answers about her daughter's death, that she took an extraordinary step. She reached out directly to Andrew Scouse. She wrote him an email, pouring her heart out, pleading with him as one parent to another. Jean had discovered that Andrew had a daughter of his own. She used this information in her appeal, asking Andrew to put himself in her shoes. How would he feel if his daughter had been brutally murdered? How would he feel if someone out there knew who had done it, but refused to help unless they got something in return? Wouldn't he do absolutely anything to see that his daughter received justice? Wouldn't he expect others to do the right thing, to help, to provide information that could bring a killer to account? Andrew's response was truly sickening. It was devoid of any empathy, any compassion, any recognition of the profound suffering Jean was experiencing. He didn't waver. He didn't soften. He didn't show even the slightest inclination toward doing the right thing simply because it was right. Instead, Andrew explained to Jean in cold, transactional terms exactly why he wouldn't help until he received what he wanted. He told her that the firearm collection that had led to his federal charge was a large part of his life, something he valued greatly. If his conviction were expunged, he explained, he could reclaim the 29 firearms that had been confiscated from him when he was arrested. 29 guns. That's what mattered to him. But Andrew didn't stop there. In what can only be described as a breathtaking display of self-justification and moral blindness, he actually declared himself to be a noble man. A noble man. Despite the fact that he was withholding information about a murder. Despite the fact that he was using a grieving mother's pain as leverage to get what he wanted. Despite all of that, he considered himself noble. When Jean countered his claim, when she asserted that a truly noble man would do the right thing without needing to be bribed or rewarded, Andrew's response was telling. He said, "I would be willing to cooperate in any and all ways that I could if the government would give me my life back." It was profoundly heartbreaking to hear this exchange, and one can only imagine how crushed Jean Zimmermann felt in that moment. She had reached out in desperation, mother to parent, human to human, hoping to appeal to something decent within Andrew Scouse. And she had been rebuffed, dismissed, told that her daughter's murder, her family's pain, her desperate need for answers, all of it was less important than Andrew's desire to get his guns back. There was nothing Jean could say or do to change Andrew's mind. No appeal to decency would work. No emotional plea would move him. He had decided what his information was worth, and he wasn't budging from that price. Instead of continuing to negotiate with Andrew, instead of trying to broker some kind of deal that would meet his demands, police communication with him began to fade. The conversation stopped. The emails went unanswered. Whether this was a strategic decision, a bureaucratic failure, or simple frustration on the part of investigators, the result was the same. Andrew Scouse was released from federal custody in 2015, and he walked away without ever providing the testimony he claimed to possess. 2 years later, in 2017, an unsealed letter from Andrew's attorney to a federal judge was released to the public. This letter revealed something that made the entire situation even more frustrating. According to the attorney, Andrew had actually changed his mind. He was now willing to testify against David Kahl for Brittany's murder. The attorney stated that numerous attempts had been made to schedule interviews with Andrew and with the investigators working Brittany's case, but nothing ever materialized. The opportunities were there. Andrew was willing. But somehow, the interviews never happened. By this point, almost 10 years had passed since Brittany's murder. 10 years without answers. 10 years without justice. 10 years of birthdays and holidays and anniversaries marked by grief instead of celebration. Brittany's family questioned why an arrest hadn't been made. They questioned why there hadn't been a clearer identification of a person of interest. They questioned why, with DNA evidence and a potential witness, the case still seemed stalled. One of Brittany's parents later recalled a visit they'd received from Police Chief Noble Ray on her husband's birthday 2.5 years earlier. Chief Ray had come to their door and told them, "We believe we have the person responsible for your daughter's death." Those words had given them hope. Finally, after so many years, they thought justice might be within reach. But as more time passed without an arrest, without charges, without any visible progress, that hope began to fade. There was pervasive doubt that the case would ever actually be solved, at least not with the way it was being handled at that time. Even if investigators had been planning some kind of action, even if they'd been building a case behind the scenes, those plans became irrelevant in August of 2017. That's when Andrew Scouse died in a motorcycle accident. Whatever information he possessed, whatever David Kahl had told him during their time together in that cell, all of it died with him. The potential star witness was gone, and any hope of using his testimony to corroborate the DNA evidence vanished. By this point, investigators working Brittany's case were fairly confident, personally convinced, that David Kahl was the person who had murdered Brittany Zimmermann. All the pieces seemed to fit. He'd been in the area that day, by his own admission. In 2016, during another round of questioning, he'd even admitted that he might have been inside Brittany's apartment on the day she died. Might have been. But he still maintained, adamantly, that he'd had nothing to do with her murder. His DNA had been found on her shirt. That was irrefutable scientific evidence. But David's defense attorney had a ready explanation for that. Any DNA found on Brittany could be explained by innocent contact. Maybe Brittany had given David money when he approached her with his flat tire scam. Maybe they'd shaken hands. Maybe she'd briefly touched his arm or his shoulder. Any of these innocent interactions could have resulted in a transfer of his DNA to her clothing. David was willing to admit to certain things. He'd admit to being in the area. He'd admit to running his scam. He'd even admit that he might have encountered Brittany at some point. But he absolutely refused to admit to murdering her. All the evidence pointed toward David. The DNA. The witness statements placing him in the area. The suspicious statements he'd allegedly made to cellmates about being worried about his fingerprints being found. The timeline that placed him in exactly the right location at exactly the right time. Everything pointed to David Kahl. But pointing wasn't proving. Suspicion wasn't evidence. Investigators needed something more. And they were running out of time. David Kahl was scheduled to be released from prison for his 7th impaired driving conviction in 2021. This prospect absolutely terrified both Brittany's family and law enforcement. If David walked out of prison as a free man, if he suspected that investigators were still actively pursuing him for Brittany's murder, which by this point seemed certain, he could easily disappear. He could leave Wisconsin, change his name, go somewhere else, start over. He could potentially never be found, or at least not found in time to face justice before he died of old age or natural causes. Investigators knew they needed to find a solution while David was still incarcerated, while they knew exactly where he was, while he couldn't run. They needed to find that additional piece of evidence, that corroborating detail, that final link that would turn their strong suspicion into an airtight case. And they needed to find it fast. It was now 2020, and the world was facing an unprecedented global health crisis. A pandemic had begun, one that would eventually shut down entire countries, change the way people lived and worked and interacted, and dominate every aspect of life for years to come. To many people around the world, it felt as though everything they'd known had ended, that the world had fundamentally changed in ways that could never be reversed. For Brittany Zimmermann's family, the world as they knew it had ended on April 2nd, 2008. Everything that mattered, everything that defined their lives as they'd been, had ceased to exist on that day when Brittany was taken from them. The pandemic, as devastating as it was for so many people, was just one more challenge in a long series of challenges they'd already been facing for 12 years. But on March 20th, 2020, as the pandemic was just beginning to shut down the country, as people were scrambling to understand what was happening and what it would mean for their lives, an announcement was made that changed everything for Brittany's family. An arrest had finally been made in Brittany Zimmermann's case. The person arrested was indeed David Kahl. After 12 years of investigation, after countless dead ends and false starts, after DNA testing and witness interviews and legal negotiations and bureaucratic delays, after everything that had gone wrong and everything that had been mishandled and everything that had taken far too long, David Kahl was finally in custody, charged with Brittany's murder. In an unconventional announcement, given the unusual circumstances of the pandemic, Madison Police Chief Victor Wall addressed the media and the public. He acknowledged the strange times everyone was living through, but he emphasized that this particular message had nothing to do with the health crisis or public health orders. This message was about something that had been waiting for resolution for far too long. Chief Wall stated, "Today's message is not about the health crisis or any public health orders. It's a message that I hope will bring closure to our community and bring justice to a family." He continued, his words carrying the weight of 12 years of frustration and determination. On April 2, 2008, almost 12 years ago, Brittany Zimmermann was taken from us in her downtown Madison apartment. Today, I can announce that criminal charges have been filed in her death. David Kahl, a 53-year-old male, has been charged in Dane County Circuit Court with first-degree intentional homicide as a party to a crime and with a dangerous weapon. What had changed? What had finally enabled investigators to move forward with charges after all these years? The answer was both simple and frustrating. Technology had advanced. DNA analysis techniques that hadn't existed or hadn't been refined in 2008 were now standard practice. The samples that had been collected from Brittany's apartment 12 years earlier, samples that had been sitting in evidence storage all that time, could now be analyzed with far greater precision and accuracy. These new analyses had allowed investigators to secure not just the DNA match from Brittany's shirt sleeve that they'd found back in 2014, but additional, stronger DNA evidence. DNA found on Brittany's jeans now also unequivocally matched David Kahl's profile. The combination of DNA from multiple locations, analyzed with modern techniques, provided the kind of scientific certainty that prosecutors needed to move forward with charges. In retrospect, investigators had possessed the killer's identity all along. His DNA had been there, preserved in those evidence samples, since day one. But they'd been forced to wait. Wait for time to pass. Wait for technology to advance. Wait for the science to catch up to what they'd suspected, but couldn't prove. It was frustrating, maddening even, to know that if these DNA techniques had been available in 2008, this case might have been solved within weeks instead of taking 12 years. But at least now, finally, they had what they needed. After being arrested and charged, after years of denials and half-admissions and carefully worded statements designed to avoid incrimination, David Kahl finally did something he'd never done before. He confessed. He told investigators everything that had happened on April 2, 2008. And his confession painted a horrifying picture of Brittany's final minutes. According to David's account, on the morning of Brittany's murder, he had been going door to door throughout the downtown Madison area, seeking money to fund his substance habit. He'd already been, by his own admission, incredibly intoxicated when he started his rounds. He was telling people the same story he'd used countless times before. He needed $40 to fix a flat tire on his car. Most people he approached turned him down. Some gave him money. It was for David just another day of scamming and using. At one point during his wandering, David actually walked right into the home of a woman who had left her door unlocked. He simply opened the door and walked in, probably hoping to find money or valuables he could take. But when the woman confronted him, told him he needed to leave immediately, David complied without argument or altercation. He left. No confrontation. No violence. He just moved on to the next opportunity. One can only imagine how that woman must have felt years later when she learned that the man who'd walked into her home that day was the same man who murdered Brittany Zimmermann just blocks away, and possibly just minutes later. How close had she come to being his victim instead? What had made the difference? Why had he left her home peacefully, but attacked Brittany? After several hours of wandering around town with mixed results, David spotted Brittany and Jordan's apartment building. He decided, on impulse, that he would break in. His hope, his assumption, was that since the door was locked from the outside, nobody would be home. It was the middle of the day. College students were usually at class or work during these hours. The apartment would be empty, and he could search for money or valuables without any interference. That assumption proved tragically, devastatingly wrong. When David forced his way through the locked door, he broke the lock and pushed his way inside, Brittany was there. She was home, sitting at her computer, studying, completely unaware that danger was about to literally break down her door. According to David's confession, things didn't immediately escalate to violence. This is an important detail because it shows that this wasn't a planned attack. David claimed, and there's no particular reason to disbelieve this part of the story, that it had never been his intention to hurt Brittany. He simply wanted money. That was all. Money to buy more drugs, to feed his addiction, to continue the lifestyle he'd been living for years. When David encountered Brittany inside the apartment, he made his pitch. He told her his flat tire story. He asked for money. And Brittany, according to David's account, told him she had no money to give him. She was a college student. She probably really didn't have much cash on hand. Most students didn't. At this point, David claimed he intended to leave. Just like he'd left the other woman's house earlier that day when she'd told him to go. He wasn't there to hurt anyone. He was there for money, and if there was no money to be had, there was no point in staying. But then David did something that would seal both his and Brittany's fates. He asked if he could use the bathroom before he left. Why did David ask to use the bathroom? Was he genuinely in need? Or was he stalling, hoping that maybe Brittany would reconsider and give him some money after all? We'll never know his true motivation. And why did Brittany say yes? Some people have suggested that she agreed because of her inherently kind and empathetic nature. This was a young woman who volunteered at cancer support facilities, who wanted to dedicate her life to helping people who saw the best in others. Maybe she felt sorry for this person, despite the fact that he'd broken into her apartment. Maybe she thought showing him some small kindness would encourage him to leave peacefully. But there's another possibility, one that's perhaps more likely given what we know about Brittany's intelligence and her acute safety awareness. It's entirely plausible that Brittany agreed to let David use the bathroom not out of kindness, but as a strategic decision. She was buying herself time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to figure out how to escape this situation or how to get help. She knew she was in danger. A stranger had just broken into her apartment. She needed to do something. And agreeing to his request for the bathroom gave her precious seconds to act. What Brittany did in those moments while David was in the bathroom was exactly what she'd been taught to do in emergency. Exactly what every safety expert, every self-defense instructor, every parent tells their children to do when they're in danger. She grabbed her cell phone and she called 911. She did everything right. She followed every rule. She made the call that was supposed to bring help, supposed to bring officers rushing to her rescue, supposed to save her life. Tragically, when David emerged from the bathroom, he found Brittany on her cell phone, clearly calling someone. He might not have known for certain that she was calling 911, but he certainly suspected it. He knew what it looked like when someone was calling for help. And he knew what would happen if police showed up and found him there, in an apartment he'd broken into, with a victim who could identify him and testify against him. According to his confession, it was at that precise moment, when he realized Brittany was calling for help, that David lost control. He later claimed he snapped. He knew Brittany was trying to summon the police, and he absolutely was not about to return to jail for breaking into her apartment. David had already endured multiple stints of incarceration for his various offenses over the years. He knew what prison was like, and he didn't want to go back. So David made a choice. A choice that would end Brittany's life and irrevocably change the lives of everyone who loved her. According to his detailed confession to investigators, David ran toward Brittany. He came up behind her and violently knocked the phone out of her hand, sending it clattering to the floor. This single action explains something that had puzzled investigators and tortured Brittany's family for 12 years. Explains why the 911 operator received no audible response from Brittany. Explains why all the dispatcher heard was muffled screaming and indistinct sounds. Brittany had literally been fighting for her life in that moment. She was being attacked by someone bigger and stronger than her. She didn't have the opportunity to speak clearly to the dispatcher, to explain where she was or what was happening, or that she desperately needed help. The phone was knocked away before she could say a word. Brittany had done everything right. She had made the call. She had connected to 911. But she never had the chance to speak, to communicate, to explain the emergency. And on the other end of that call, the dispatcher made the fateful decision not to send help, not to investigate, not to treat muffled screaming as the obvious emergency that it was. After knocking the phone from Brittany's hand, David grabbed her and dragged her from wherever they'd been standing into the bedroom. He threw her onto the bed. Then he grabbed a nearby t-shirt, possibly one of Jordan's shirts or one of Brittany's own, and wrapped it around her neck. He began strangling her, cutting off her air supply, cutting off the blood flow to her brain. Brittany fought. Of course she fought. The autopsy had shown defensive wounds, evidence of struggle. But David was stronger, and he had the advantage of surprise and position. Eventually, according to David's account, Brittany stopped moving. She'd likely lost consciousness from the strangulation. Her body went limp beneath him. But David noticed something that terrified him. Brittany was still breathing. Her chest was still rising and falling. Air was still moving in and out of her lungs. She was unconscious, but she wasn't dead. And if she wasn't dead, she could wake up. She could survive. She could identify him. She could testify against him. She could send him to prison for the rest of his life. David couldn't allow that to happen. So he made another choice, one that transformed this crime from a break-in that went wrong into premeditated, intentional murder. He left Brittany lying unconscious on the bed, walked to the kitchen, and retrieved a knife from a butcher's block on the counter. Then he returned to the bedroom and began stabbing Brittany repeatedly, making absolutely certain she would be dead by the time he left that apartment. The autopsy had documented multiple stab wounds. Nearly half of them had been directed at Brittany's heart. David wasn't just stabbing randomly. He was aiming for vital organs, ensuring a fatal outcome. It was brutal. It was vicious. It was overkill in the most literal sense of that word. When David finally left the apartment, he left Brittany on the bed, or so his confession stated. But there's a haunting discrepancy here that suggests something even more horrific might have occurred. Jordan, when he discovered Brittany's body approximately 45 minutes later, found her in the hallway or doorway leading to the bedroom, not on the bed itself. If David's confession was accurate, and he left Brittany on the bed, that means Brittany must have moved after he left. Despite the strangulation, despite the multiple stab wounds, despite the massive blood loss, Brittany somehow regained consciousness. With her last reserves of strength, her final moments of life, she tried to get up. She tried to reach a phone, or reach the door, or escape the apartment, or do anything to save herself. The thought is absolutely haunting. To imagine Brittany wounded and dying, using her last bit of energy to try to get help, to try to survive, while police still hadn't been dispatched to her apartment despite her 911 call almost an hour earlier. If officers had been sent immediately when that call came in, they would have arrived while David was still in the apartment or shortly after he fled. They might have caught him. And most importantly, they might have found Brittany still alive, still fighting, still clinging to life. Emergency medical services might have been able to save her. But nobody came. And Brittany died alone on the floor of her apartment, probably still hoping, still praying, that at any moment she would hear sirens approaching, footsteps on the stairs, officers bursting through the broken door to save her. After his arrest and confession, David Kahl initially entered a plea of not guilty. His trial was scheduled for January 2023, almost 3 years after his arrest. But as that trial date approached, as David sat in jail contemplating the evidence against him, the strength of the prosecution's case, and the likelihood of conviction, something changed. After what his defense attorney described as a period of profound soul-searching and reflection, David ultimately made the decision to change his plea. He would plead guilty as part of a negotiated plea agreement with prosecutors. The terms of that agreement were specific. If David pleaded guilty to first-degree intentional homicide, the state would not contest a petition for extended supervision after he served 20 years of his sentence. This didn't mean David would necessarily be released after 20 years. It meant only that after 20 years, he could petition for release, and the state wouldn't automatically object to that petition. David and his defense attorneys found this agreement acceptable for a specific reason. By the time of his plea, David had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a serious mental illness. His attorneys even requested that he be sentenced to life in prison as soon as possible so that he could be transferred to a correctional facility equipped with mental health services that could treat his condition. The sooner he was sentenced, the sooner he could access the treatment he needed. The schizophrenia diagnosis raised questions about David's mental state, but it never posed an issue for his sentencing or conviction. A judge had already ruled that David was competent to stand trial, competent to understand the charges against him, and competent to participate in his own defense. Mental illness doesn't automatically equal incompetence, and in David's case, the illness was being treated, was under control, and didn't prevent him from understanding what he'd done or the consequences he was facing. At his sentencing hearing, David offered an apology to everyone affected by his actions. He said, "I would like to apologize to everybody, especially the Zimmermann family. I took away Brittany's 21-year-old life, a family that she could have had. The words were there, the sentiment was expressed, but for Brittany's family, no apology could ever be sufficient. No expression of regret could bring their daughter back. No amount of remorse could erase 12 years of waiting, of wondering, of living with unanswered questions. And no prison sentence, however long, could truly balance the scales of justice for a life taken so violently, so senselessly, so unnecessarily. Many aspects of Brittany Zimmermann's case remain profoundly troubling, even with David Kahl's conviction and imprisonment. The first and most obvious is the sheer amount of time it took to solve this case. 12 years. 12 years from the day Brittany was murdered to the day her killer was finally arrested. 12 years of her family living in limbo, not knowing who had taken their daughter from them or why, or whether that person would ever face justice. What makes this delay even more frustrating is the knowledge that investigators had actually collected David Kahl's DNA from the crime scene on day one. It was there, preserved in evidence from the very beginning. They'd done everything right in terms of evidence collection. They'd gathered samples thoroughly and carefully. They'd followed proper procedures. They'd preserved the integrity of the crime scene. The DNA was there. But the technology to analyze it definitively, to extract clear and unambiguous profiles from mixed or degraded samples, simply didn't exist yet in 2008. They had the evidence, but they couldn't use it. Not yet. If those DNA analysis techniques had been available in 2008 or 2009, if the science had been just a few years more advanced, David Kahl might have been arrested within weeks or months of Brittany's death, instead of taking more than a decade. Brittany's family might have had answers before her wedding day came and went. Before countless birthdays and holidays were marked with grief instead of celebration. Before a decade of their lives was consumed by unanswered questions and unresolved pain. There's also the terrifying reality that if David had been released from prison for his impaired driving conviction before the DNA technology advanced enough to definitively link him to Brittany's murder, he very easily could have disappeared. He could have left Wisconsin. He could have changed his name, moved across the country, started over somewhere else. And Brittany's case might never have been solved. David might have taken the truth to his grave, leaving Brittany's family without answers forever. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire case, the element that continues to generate anger and frustration even years later, is the catastrophic failure of the 911 system. This failure is truly terrifying to contemplate because it strikes at the heart of one of our most fundamental assumptions about safety and emergency response. From childhood, we're all taught the same thing. If you're in danger, if you need help, if there's an emergency, call 911. We teach this to our children. We remind ourselves of it. We trust that if we make that call, help will come. The system will work. Someone will respond. That's the social contract, the unspoken agreement between citizens and emergency services. You call, we come. Always. Brittany Zimmermann did everything she was supposed to do. She recognized danger. She assessed her situation. She made the call. She connected to 911. The system received her call. And then the system failed her completely and catastrophically. The dispatcher heard muffled screaming, heard sounds of distress, heard clear indications that something was wrong, and made the decision not to investigate, not to dispatch officers, not to treat this as the obvious emergency that it was. Instead, the call was dismissed as accidental. No callback was made to verify. No officers were sent to check. Nothing was done. For 48 minutes, Brittany lay dying in her apartment, less than a mile from the police station. Officers could have been there in 3 or 4 minutes if they'd been dispatched immediately. They could have arrived while David was still in the apartment. They could have apprehended him at the scene. And most importantly, most heartbreakingly, they might have found Brittany still alive. Emergency medical services might have been able to treat her wounds, stop the bleeding, save her life. But nobody came. And Brittany died alone, probably spending her final conscious moments wondering why the help she'd called for hadn't arrived, why nobody was coming to save her, why she was going to die despite doing everything right. The 911 failure in Brittany's case did lead to some positive changes. The controversy and public outrage sparked a comprehensive review of 911 dispatch procedures throughout Wisconsin and in many other states as well. Protocols were strengthened to ensure that ambiguous calls, especially those with any indication of distress like screaming or sounds of struggle, receive immediate response and thorough investigation. Callback procedures were formalized and made mandatory. Standards were established that didn't differentiate between landlines and cell phones. These reforms have potentially saved other lives. Other people who called 911 in distress, who couldn't speak clearly, or whose calls were initially unclear, likely receive help that they might not have received before Brittany's case exposed the flaws in the system. In that sense, Brittany's death, as tragic and senseless as it was, has contributed to meaningful improvements in public safety. Brittany's family has worked tirelessly to ensure that something positive came from their daughter's death, that the failures that cost Brittany her life led to changes that would protect others. They've advocated for improved 911 training. They've pushed for better technology and better protocols. They've shared their story publicly, despite how painful it is, because they want to prevent other families from experiencing what they've experienced. It's also worth noting that Kelly Nolan's case, the college student who disappeared the summer before Brittany's death, remains unsolved to this day. David Kahl was never connected to Kelly's disappearance or death. He never confessed to any involvement. No evidence was ever found linking him to her case. Kelly's family continues their search for answers, continues their fight for justice, continues hoping that someday, somehow, they'll learn what happened to their daughter. The possibility that there might be other unsolved cases in Madison from that same time period, other victims who never received justice, is a sobering reminder that David Kahl's conviction, while crucial for Brittany's family, doesn't answer every question or solve every mystery from those troubled years. If Brittany had lived, she would be in her late 30s now. Her family has no doubt whatsoever that she would have achieved her dream of becoming a doctor. They're certain she would have specialized in infectious diseases, just as she'd always planned. They believe she would have made significant contributions to medical science, that she might have been involved in research or treatment development for conditions exactly like the pandemic that was raging when her killer was finally arrested. Brittany would have married Jordan. They would have had children together. Their home would have been filled with laughter and love, and probably quite a few cats, which were Brittany's favorite animals. She would have been a mother, a wife, a doctor, a friend, a daughter. She would have lived a full life, rich with meaning and purpose and connection. Instead, all of that potential, all of those possibilities, all of those years of life and love and achievement were stolen from her by a man who broke into her apartment looking for $40 to buy drugs. During the pandemic, when medical professionals and researchers were working around the clock to understand and combat a novel virus, Brittany Zimmermann couldn't help but think about how much Brittany would have contributed to those efforts. Infectious diseases were precisely the kind of challenge Brittany was passionate about addressing. She would have been on the front lines in the laboratories doing everything in her power to help people, to save lives, to make a difference. But she never got that chance. There's one particular detail from the day of Brittany's death that continues to haunt her family, especially her mother Jean. That phone call Brittany made to her mother at 11:57 a.m., just about 20 minutes before she was attacked. The call that went unanswered. Jean was probably busy with something that seemed important at the time. Something that needed her attention, right then. She'd call Brittany back later. There would be time to talk. There was always time. Except there wasn't. Brittany died approximately 30 minutes after trying to reach her mother. If Jean had answered that call, they might have chatted for a few minutes. Maybe Brittany just wanted to say hello, to hear her mom's voice, to share something about her day. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe the timeline would have unfolded exactly the same way, and Brittany would still have been home when David broke in. But maybe not. Maybe if they'd talked for 10 or 15 minutes, Brittany would have still been on the phone with her mother when David broke down the door. Jean would have heard the commotion. She would have immediately called 911 herself. She would have been screaming at the dispatcher to send officers to her daughter's apartment right now. This very second, there's an emergency, someone's breaking in. Maybe that would have made the difference. Maybe help would have been sent. We'll never know. And that uncertainty, that eternal what if, is something Brittany Zimmermann has to live with every single day. The knowledge that she missed her daughter's final attempt to reach her, that those were the last minutes of Brittany's normal life before everything changed forever, is a burden no parent should ever have to carry. This case compels all of us to reach out to our loved ones more often, to tell them how much they mean to us, to not put off that phone call, or that visit, or that conversation because we think we'll have time later. As cliché as it might sound, the truth is profound and undeniable. We never know when someone we love will be taken from us. We never know when a normal, ordinary day will become the last day. We never know when talk to you later will turn into never. It's a terrifying thought when you really sit with it. That morning, Brittany had been happy, full of life, worried about final exams and papers and all the normal stresses of college life. Things that seemed important in the moment, but would become completely meaningless just hours later. She had no idea that April 2nd, 2008 would be the last day of her life. She had no idea that the biggest concern on her mind that morning, whatever academic challenge she was facing, would never be resolved because she wouldn't live long enough to take that exam or submit that paper. It's chilling to consider the chain of random events and small decisions that led to Brittany being in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. If she had decided to study at the campus library with her friend instead of going home. If she'd had a class scheduled at noon that kept her on campus for another hour. If she decided to grab lunch somewhere before heading home. If she'd stopped to run an errand. Any of these small, mundane decisions would have meant she wasn't home when David Kahl decided to break into that particular apartment building. She and Jordan would have both been somewhere else, somewhere safe, going about their normal lives. David would have broken into an empty apartment, taken whatever he found, and left. And Brittany would still be alive today. But those aren't the decisions she made. She went home. She logged onto her computer. She started studying. And David Kahl broke down her door. There's a natural human tendency to imagine alternate timelines, to wonder what could have been different, to wish we could go back and change just one small thing that would cascade into a completely different outcome. But we can't. What happened, happened. The past is fixed. And Brittany is gone. What we can do is honor her memory by learning from what happened to her. By advocating for better emergency response systems. By teaching our children to be safety conscious, but not fearful. By remembering that a life of purpose and service, like the life Brittany was building for herself, is a life worth celebrating and emulating. We can also take comfort, however cold that comfort might be, in knowing that justice was eventually served. It took 12 years, far longer than it should have. It involved countless failures and frustrations along the way. But in the end, David Kahl was caught. He was charged. He confessed. He was convicted. And he will spend the rest of his life in prison, never able to hurt anyone else the way he hurt Brittany Zimmermann and her family. David Kahl will never walk the streets as a free man again. He will never have the opportunity to break into another apartment, to attack another victim, to destroy another family. He will grow old behind bars, and he will eventually die behind bars, paying for what he did on April 2nd, 2008. That's not enough. It can never be enough. No punishment could ever truly balance the scales for a life taken so violently, for so much potential destroyed, for so much pain inflicted. But it's something. It's closure. It's accountability. It's justice, delayed and imperfect, but justice nonetheless. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Untold Cold Case. Brittany Zimmermann's story is a difficult one, filled with tragedy, frustration, and systemic failures that should never have occurred. But it's also a story about persistence, about a family that never gave up fighting for justice, about investigators who kept working the case even when it seemed hopeless, and about how advancing technology can finally bring answers even when years or decades have passed. If this case has moved you in any way, if Brittany's story has touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button below this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your reactions, or your own experiences with similar cases. And please subscribe to The Untold Cold Case and ring that notification bell so you never miss another episode. Your engagement, your likes, your comments, your subscriptions, all of these things help us continue bringing you these important stories, honoring the memories of victims like Brittany, and keeping their cases in the public eye. Remember to reach out to your loved ones today. Tell them how much they mean to you. Don't wait for the right time, because that time might never come. Make the call. Send the message. Share your love while you still have the chance. Stay safe out there. Lock your doors. Stay aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And remember that if you ever find yourself in danger, calling for help is always the right decision. The system failed Brittany Zimmermann, but the reforms that came from her case have made that system stronger and more reliable for everyone. Until next time, this has been The Untold Cold Case. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.